concept of a nuclear train emerged in the mid-20th century nuclear boom, because of course it did. A time when scientists envisioned hundreds of innovative ways to harness nuclear power for everyday improvements. Transportation, in particular, featured prominently among these ideas.
Nuclear power in locomotives, submarines, ships, and even very large airplanes may all but revolutionize future transportation.
Nuclear-powered aircraft, submarines, cars, yes really, aircraft carriers and trains were all considered realistic possibilities. Yep, the nuclear car, the Ford Nuclear, and I believe we have a video about it. Yet only a few of these concepts ever became a reality. Nuclear trains specifically were viewed as a straightforward upgrade from traditional locomotives, offering fuel savings and reduced global carbon footprints. In fact, several detailed designs were developed and even patented, and there were military projects that received government backing. However, despite the initial enthusiasm for the idea, every careful analysis eventually concluded that developing a nuclear locomotive simply didn't make sense. We're really sorry about that, but here is why. So in the 1950s, nuclear power is still in its infancy. Although some scientists accurately predicted its capabilities, nuclear energy was emerging as a new field of exploration. As it became increasingly evident that humanity had stumbled upon a source of energy so powerful it could seemingly solve all of the world's problems. How did that go? Innovative engineering ideas began appearing everywhere. Suddenly, nuclear was seen as a one-size-fits-all solution, and trains were just another entry on the list of things that could be improved with this remarkable technology. This idea, more than anything, remains a product of its time. In theory, nuclear trains could completely replace traditional locomotives, which are limited by the need to remain near power lines or stop frequently for coal or oil refueling. A nuclear train could continuously chug along the rails for months, possibly even years, before needing to refuel. In fact, the X-12, the world's first design for a nuclear locomotive, theoretically could have circumnavigated the globe twice before its initial refueling. Some Snowpiercer shit right there. Of course, we cannot know this for certain since the X-12 was never built. However, the man behind its design, Dr. Lyle Borst, stated in an interview with Life magazine, beyond its remarkable fuel efficiency, a nuclear train would also simplify power line maintenance because it would run independently with no reliance on the electric grid. Significantly less time and fewer resources would be required for upkeep. This advantage would be particularly beneficial in countries like the United States and the USSR, both of which have hundreds of kilometers of train tracks located far from populated areas. A nuclear locomotive could offer all of these benefits while minimizing its carbon footprint. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, this wouldn't have been a major selling point because the public wasn't as aware of the impact rising levels of carbon dioxide could have. However, it was significant for physicists who recognized the potential importance of reducing our collective carbon footprint. Given these advantages, it's natural that the two greatest world powers at the time, the United States and the USSR, were drawn to the idea. Today's video is brought to you by the wonderful people over at Squarespace, longtime sponsors and friends of the show. They are the platform that I have used to build and make websites without the headaches of coding or server maintenance. Obviously, can you imagine me doing coding? Be like, sorry, you coded that thing? I'd be like, you what? I code about as well as I speak foreign languages. Actually worse, because I can half speak a foreign language. And server maintenance? I'm not entirely sure what a server is. I jokingly refer to them as mainframes. It just works. That's Squarespace's thing. You could focus on what you actually are supposed to be doing, like the bigger picture stuff, not the setup and all the nitty gritty. Plus, they've got this fantastic thing called Blueprint AI, which basically you tell it your idea for a website and it builds this custom site for you with the content, layout, design suggestions, all just ready to go. It's like next level drag and drop. You'll love it. Second, there's analytics. It's built in so you can actually see how people are finding your site, where they're coming from, what's worth improving, all without those third-party plugins that I've used other website builders in the past before Squarespace was sponsoring me, and you'd install a plugin and it'd just be like, oh, it broke the whole website. Brilliant. So if you've got an idea worth putting online, head to squarespace.com/megaprojects for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use the offer code MEGAPROJECTS to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's episode. There were dozens of atomic train ideas and proposals across the globe at the time. But the first to represent an actual design with feasibility calculations was that of the aforementioned Dr. Borst of the University of Utah, who've already done a deep dive, actually, on the X-12 if you're interested in a detailed breakdown. But in short, the X-12 was a breathtaking idea during that era. The locomotive would be powered by an atomic reactor that splits uranium, releasing tremendous amounts of energy in the form of heat and generating steam by boiling water. It's how nuclear power works. Now, this steam would then pass through a pressurizer and drive turbines connected to generators, converting mechanical energy into electrical energy. Like I said, this is how nuclear power works. The big thing was here, it would have to be compact enough to fit in a train. The massive electric motors, capable of producing 7,000 horsepower, would propel the train forward, while the X-12 would primarily transport cargo. It could eventually be adapted for passengers as well. And the Soviets, they had a similar idea. Of course they did. It was that time of the century, although their efforts began 2 years after the Americans. In 1956, the Ministry of Transport initiated a campaign for several atomic train designs. It comes as no surprise that the Soviets were particularly interested in nuclear power trains. After all, they operated one of the largest railway networks in the world at the time, and the prospect of saving fuel was undeniably attractive. Now, one of the designs was created by the forgotten Soviet engineer Yuri Maralovich, who also happens to be one of the minds behind the world's first nuclear-powered icebreaker and, more broadly, the world's first nuclear-powered ship, the Lenin. Maralovich set out to completely revolutionize the Soviet railway system. For one thing, the train he designed was not a double-decker, it was also much wider than Soviet trains at the time. He proposed widening the rails from 1.524 meters, the standard distance of Soviet tracks established in the 19th century, to 4.5 meters. Again, some Snowpiercer shit right there. What the f*** do we do? By widening the tracks, the freight cars could be increased threefold in width, height, and length, allowing each car's cargo capacity to be increased approximately 27 times. As Maralovich puts it, a single car could, for example, carry 1,600 tons of wheat instead of the standard 60 tons from Moscow to Vladivostok. One of the biggest issues behind this revolution was the source of power. What could propel the monstrously large trains Maralovich planned on building? Well, he found the answer in nuclear energy, which is honestly just real cool. These batteries are similar to nuclear reactors in that they both generate electricity from nuclear energy, but there are a few major differences between the two. For one thing, a battery doesn't rely on a controlled chain reaction to release heat. Instead, it produces heat and in turn electricity through the decay of radioactive particles. Now, the downside of this generation method lies in its scale, as nuclear batteries just can't match nuclear reactors for their sheer power. However, this lower output is, at least in theory, actually pretty perfect for a nuclear train. Now, perhaps the most significant challenge of a nuclear train, and this is something that we'll discuss in great detail later, is safety. And all scientists agree, rather obviously, that if you put a nuclear reactor in a train, you've got to build a shield around it to prevent a nuclear disaster. The shield has to be massive. It's going to weigh hundreds of tons, which means you need even more power to push your train onward. You also require a team of experts to control and maintain that radioactive core at all times. Now, with a nuclear battery, you don't need that, since its power output is passively controlled by the natural process of decay, which makes it generally less likely to cause a disaster. Even in the event of a crash, the radioactive energy released would just be incomparable to that of a nuclear reactor. For this reason, nuclear batteries have been used for decades across a whole bunch of fields. They are common in satellites and moon landers, with the Perseverance Mars rover employing them, and they were even used in pacemakers before lithium-powered pacemakers became available in the late 1980s. Yup, nuclear battery in your heart. Whether they'd rely on a nuclear reactor or nuclear batteries, the engines of the Soviet atomic train could, in theory, exceed speeds of 200 kilometers per hour. Yet, thanks to wider tracks, the train wouldn't sway. Maralovitch's atomic train was designed to carry cargo and passengers from Moscow to St. Petersburg, known as Leningrad back in the day, in just 4 hours, roughly the same travel time as the journey takes today. Slightly ahead of its time then. Despite its detailed and sensible design, however, Maralovitch's train was never built, a fate that seems to have befallen every single nuclear train blueprint. West Germany entertained a similar concept, one inspired by Nazi Germany's developments in nuclear-powered submarines during the 1940s. In the 1950s, the German manufacturing company Krauss-Maffei seriously considered developing a 35-kilometer-long nuclear train, but ultimately abandoned the project. The idea came closest to moving beyond the blueprint stage for military purposes. Both the US Army and the Soviets explored the possibility of an all-terrain nuclear-powered land train. For the Americans, it was just a good logistical solution. The Army was actively seeking ways to harness nuclear energy, and besides manufacturing more nuclear bombs, they saw opportunities to improve logistics. The Army managed numerous remote bases, some of which were, and continue to be, situated in meteorologically hazardous regions. Each base requires the regular movement of fuel, water, food, supplies, and personnel, and logistical challenges grew as the distance between a base and the nearest populated area increased. With its very recent experience in World War II and first-hand knowledge of how quickly fuel could ignite during conflicts, the Army understood the critical need for a transport solution that would minimize fuel consumption. And, well, cue the land train. Now, this train would consist of multiple cars designed for both on-road and off-road travel. Unlike a traditional train, it wouldn't require tracks to move, while also saving on fuel, since it would be powered by a small nuclear reactor. In contrast to the X-12, this land train was small and light, meaning it wouldn't need nearly as much power. This opened the door for using a tiny nuclear reactor or even those nuclear batteries that we mentioned earlier. Now, the Army actually designed a diesel-powered prototype and later followed it up with a nuclear prototype, although neither design ever advanced beyond the testing phase. Despite the lightweight, high-powered design allowing for enormous amounts of cargo to be transported with virtually no fuel consumption, the design was, for reasons unknown, never approved for production. But the Soviets, well, they took this a step further. While logistical challenges played a part, they were also eager to establish a presence in the far north. Transporting supplies to extremely cold environments was really quite hard at the time. In fact, still a bit hard today. An idea was proposed by Soviet Minister of Medium Machine Building Yefim Slavsky, the same guy who insisted on developing the Tsar bomber, by the way, which is the most powerful thermonuclear weapon known to man, and just because why not, he was also one of the individuals responsible for the Chernobyl disaster. In 1955, he suggested developing a mobile nuclear power plant capable of supplying electricity to remote military and civilian facilities. This self-propelled nuclear train would approach a settlement, provide power for several years, and then move on to serve another area. It was also seen as a far more viable solution than constructing a permanent power plant in the permafrost desert. Just 2 years later, the first design of the TES-3 was ready. Initially conceived as a nuclear train, the rail-dependent design was quickly abandoned in favor of a version with tank tracks. The bodies of the cars were described as wagon type in the original plans, but they ultimately replaced the train chassis with an elongated, heavy tank chassis. This change was poetic, as the TES-3 was built in St. Petersburg, Kirov plant, the very same factory that had phased out KV-1 tanks during the Second World War. In 1961, this train-tank hybrid beast became the world's first mobile land-based nuclear power plant. Kind of amazed, seeing as I run a channel about this stuff, that I've never heard of this. The presence of Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, at its unveiling underscored the magnitude of this achievement for Soviet nuclear engineering. During its testing phase, which began in 1961 and ended in 1965, the TES-3 operated for 13,000 hours without any accidents. Despite these favorable testing results, however, the TES-3 never actually traveled to the far north to fulfill its intended purpose. The entire project was eventually scrapped, the reactor was shut down, and the components of this nuclear land train now gather dust at the Obninsk Institute of Physics and Power Engineering. The Soviets, however, they had another idea, and this one actually came to fruition. To hide their intercontinental ballistic missiles from American spy planes, Soviet leadership devised a plan to load them onto a train. This train would cruise along the USSR's endless railways in random patterns, making it nearly impossible for the spy planes to detect it. The ICBMs were to be launched only as a retaliatory measure should the USSR find itself under attack. It was, of course, the Soviets' way of saying, if I'm going to hell, I'm taking you with me. Now, the missiles weighed more than 104 metric tons each, and moving them around, along with the added weight of the train, operating modules, facilities, and crew, required a tremendous amount of fuel. Naturally, the idea of powering the train with a nuclear reactor emerged. This method had already been successfully tested for the TES-3. However, for reasons that remain unclear, the Soviets ultimately chose a traditional power source. The RT-23 Molodets, which is the official name of the ICBM system, entered service in 1987. Notably, the only nuclear parts of the system were the nuclear warheads. And that was the last time that the world heard about atomic trains for a bit of a while. In 2008, however, Mr. William Gregory Taylor filed a patent proposition with the US Patent and Trademark Office. In his proposition, he described pairing an onboard nuclear reactor with a magnetically levitated vehicle, the world's first and so far the only mention of a nuclear maglev. One of the most recent references to a nuclear train as of the time of recording actually came in 2011. At that time, the vice president of Russian Railways announced that they would present a nuclear train by the end of the year. However, the train never even got that far, and it remains completely unknown what ultimately happened to it. There appears to be a bit of an emerging pattern with nuclear trains. They are most often designed and never move an inch further than that, or maybe a prototype is built, but that's about it. So, why is that? Why were there so many ideas, designs, and even prototypes of nuclear-powered trains that just never advanced beyond testing, and in some cases, never even left the drawing board? Now, the biggest selling points of a nuclear train are its fuel efficiency and low carbon emissions. However, if we look beyond these advantages, it becomes clear that the concept is burdened by an array of logistical problems and pretty major safety concerns. The first of many logistical challenges is the cost of building the damn thing. The X-12 would have cost $1.2 million, which sounds reasonable, except that's $1954, which is about $14 million today. For comparison, constructing a passenger locomotive would require around $5 million, meaning that nearly 3 traditional locomotives could be built for just the price of one X-12. Now, the project was obviously facing major financial setbacks, but Dr. Borst, the guy who really wanted the nuclear trains, maintained that his project, the X-12, would be financially viable, eventually paying for itself. Whether that would be the case is beside the point, given the many other issues that have kept this idea from becoming a reality. Let's get into those, and one such issue is maintenance. While traditional trains require routine upkeep, an atomic train would need a team of experts to continually monitor its core. This onboard team would have to be present at all times to react if the core begins to overheat. Moreover, because nuclear physicists are quite hard to come by and get really well paid, their compensation would significantly impact the train's operating costs. Radioactive waste management presents another massive issue. According to the World Nuclear Association, however, radioactive waste is not as hazardous or as difficult to manage as people often believe when compared to other types of toxic waste. Additionally, the sheer amount of waste produced is unimpressive compared to other electricity generation technologies. Nonetheless, once that is taken into account, it is still necessary to store the waste for approximately 100,000 years, and time is not the only challenge in this regard. Space also becomes an issue, particularly if an entire fleet of nuclear trains were built. These trains would leave behind tons of radioactive waste as they traveled along the world's railways, creating a need for storage that, of course, doesn't come without cost. Thus, radioactive waste becomes another item on the nuclear train's to-do list, requiring further investment for its safe transport and storage. However, perhaps the most common argument against nuclear trains is that they're redundant. And, we kind of already have them if you think about it. In 2013, the UK decided to rely on EDF Energy's nuclear power plants to electrify its trains. After all, Network Rail is the country's largest power consumer, and of 2024, only 38% of its network had been electrified. Railway electrification is currently one of the largest infrastructural projects in the UK, and once completed, all trains could, in theory, be powered by electricity from nuclear power plants. This shift would mark a significant step toward greening the entire country and play a crucial role in achieving the nation's goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Unfortunately for nuclear trains, this example clearly illustrates why loading a tiny nuclear reactor onto a locomotive makes little sense. We already possess a really efficient method of transporting electricity from nuclear plants to trains. Shrinking the power source and placing it directly on the train would require considerable effort and countless man-hours, while essentially achieving the same result. Moreover, it would also expose many people to potential risks, arguably the strongest argument against nuclear trains. Safety and security concerns regarding nuclear power, they've been at the forefront of discussions since 1945, when the world first witnessed what nuclear power can do when weaponized. When it comes to safety, the idea involves transporting a nuclear reactor through cities, towns, counties, and even across countries. Moving the most potent source of energy known to man across multiple jurisdictions is likely to spark legal complications, and it is doubtful that every country would welcome a nuclear train with open arms, and with pretty good reason. There's a clear sense of public paranoia surrounding nuclear energy. The Chernobyl disaster is, in fact, one of the main reasons why the Soviets abandoned most of their nuclear projects, and a more recent incident, one pertaining specifically to trains, presents an even stronger argument against the nuclear version. You see, in June of 2002, a train transporting a nuclear flask, that's a type of shipping container used for active nuclear materials, collided with a lorry at a crossing in Kent. Oh, that's where I'm from. Emergency teams immediately responded and, to everyone's relief, found the flask to be empty. Despite this, anti-nuclear campaigners rightfully questioned the safety of this type of transport, with the most important question being, well, what if that nuclear flask had actually been full? As it doesn't matter whether the locomotive is powered by diesel or nuclear, a train can still crash. And the consequences of a radioactive leak from a train crash could be catastrophic. The designers of atomic trains were well aware of this risk, which is why reactor protection is always a priority in their designs. It's a valid solution, though it always deepens the financial burden of the design. Consider the example of the X-12. This engine is powered by a small reactor core measuring only 36 by 10 inches. Certainly not something you would call big. However, to safeguard this reactor, a ludicrously large safe must encase it. This safe would weigh about 200 tons, representing roughly 55% of the entire locomotive's weight. In contrast, Mihailovich's train design featured an even larger shield, weighing between 500 and 600 tons. In either case, a massive chunk of energy produced by the reactor would be wasted on moving its shield, a design that is just incredibly inefficient. This significant drawback stems from the simple fact that we still cannot guarantee the absolute safety of nuclear reactors regardless of their size. However, even if these shields could render the reactors perfectly safe, and even if the concept of a nuclear train were to pass legislation and attract investors, another glaring issue remains on the road to reality. And that's unfortunately terrorism. No country would risk the safety of its citizens solely to lower its railway's carbon footprint. Nuclear terrorism is such a serious security threat that the United Nations has developed a specialized program dedicated exclusively to preventing terrorists from acquiring the means to develop nuclear weapons. Security experts are determined to keep nuclear materials out of terrorists' hands because, frankly, building a dirty bomb is not that difficult, and no one wants terrorists with nukes. Even the kind of shitty version of them. In fact, a US senator once invited representatives from several weapons laboratories to discuss nuclear weapons and asked if they could build an off-the-shelf nuclear device. A few months later, one of the laboratories reached out to him and simply said, "We built one." That senator, by the way, was Joe Biden, and he shared this story in 2004, long before he became vice president. Later in that role, he influenced Obama's policies by highlighting the importance of keeping nuclear weapons away from terrorists, a responsibility he considered one of the administration's most crucial tasks. Hey, Barack, really important we don't let the terrorists get nukes. All right, Joe. You got it, buddy. Building a nuclear device is not the primary challenge. It is, of course, obtaining the nuclear material. If you were to build a nuclear train, you'd need to keep a security team on board at all times. However, security alone wouldn't be enough. Screening for threats would also need to take place beforehand, as it is almost certain that someone would be interested in seizing that nuclear reactor. There is no shield to mitigate this threat. A mobile reactor would represent a huge weak point, a vulnerability that rightfully would alarm every world leader. Even if we could somehow overcome all of the other drawbacks of a nuclear train, the vulnerability of terrorism alone is the final nail in the atomic train's coffin. As a result, it's highly unlikely we'll ever see one of these in operation. I mean, would it work? Yeah. Would it pay off? I mean, in terms of environment? Also, yeah, but at the same time, it would develop into a financial black hole and present a massive safety and security threat. We already possess methods that allow us to power trains using nuclear energy, and when you draw the line, the risk-to-benefit ratio of these technologies fares far better than that of nuclear trains. And that is simply why this idea is just probably going to remain on paper forever. Thanks for watching.